Hello, happy Saturday. It's Danielle and Jonathan again from Kepperling Preservation Services talking to you about how to preserve and restore and maintain your building. So yesterday we talked about the why maintenance is important and why maintenance is preservation. Today we're going to talk to you about how to come up with a plan to maintain your building. So if you have any questions, if you feel free to type them in. There's a little bit of a delay. We'll definitely come on and tell it, and we'll answer them as we go. We do have a emailed in question too that we'll go over at the end. So when you're maintaining a building and you want to make a systematic plan so that you don't miss anything, you want to make sure that you set your priorities. So your first priority should be to make sure that the building is safe and that the structure is sound. After that, you want to make sure that your envelope, the walls, the roof, and everything that encompasses that is sealed tight. Not tight like not breathable, but tight like you're keeping the water and the weather out of the building. Then you do the utilities, because you can't, like if you need to change out systems or anything like that, you don't want to do your finish work and then have to do it twice. If you're planning your project out, you should be able to do both of those, plan it so that you do the utilities, at least the rough ends, and then do your finish work. And we actually just looked at a project where that was the goal. We only want to do, the plaster in this room once. So to get the mechanicals up to the second floor, we need to plan that into the project. So that the mechanicals can get to the second floor, but the plaster doesn't have to be disturbed more than once. Then you do your interior finishes. That's the fun stuff. That's what everybody wants to do first. And then your exterior, which would be the landscaping. So, and you want to, your maintenance audit needs to go through and like we talked about yesterday, needs to document the conditions, the current conditions. It needs to have a plan. Typically we do like in three-step plan. Intermediate needs, there's like, if there's an emergency, that needs to be at the very top. But then the intermediate or the immediate needs, which are 1 to 2 years, the intermediate, which are 3 to 5, and then the long term, which are 5 plus. And if you can plan those out, you can definitely save money to pay for it and come up, have a plan of attack going into it, knowing you're going to choose the best providers and materials for that project. And then you also want to document it and then go through area by area. And when we do a maintenance audit for a client, we go, I usually start on the exterior and go through, that we go through system by system. So the first step would be the roofing. You want to look and see what the materials are doing. Are they warping? Are they cracking? Wood shingles will curl. If it's a metal roof, it'll rust. What does asphalt do when
it dries out, it cracks, the nails can pop through.
So look and see how your roof is wearing. And then you want to look at the structure. Some of that you can visually see from the outside, like if it's sagging. Some of it you'll have to look from the inside. But if it's sagging, if the rafters are deteriorating, if there's water getting in, that becomes an emergency. And then you want to look at your flashing, which is the metal around like any penetrations. They don't consider drip edge flashing, do they?
Yeah, it's any like metal that it protects features of the house from getting water in is really like drip edge is considered flashing. Counter flashing around the like where like a roof meets another wall, or around a fireplace, or even over windows or doors you can find flashing.
They call that a water table though, don't they?
The water table is usually at the
or lower
at the cornice area.
Oh, okay. So yeah, but if you have any of those issues, if you see any rusting, if you see the paint's flaking off, if you see any sagging, any missing pieces, any blockage in the gutters, if you notice that the drainage isn't working. So like if the downspouts dumping out, but it's dumping right under the foundation, that will be an issue. So there, and make sure if you're replacing gutters or downspouts, especially if they're exterior or the external gutters, that you use half round or and then round or square downspouts, not K gutters, and not corrugated downspouts. And then if it's an interior gutter, that's a whole other issue. But that's typical, a major typical failure that we see.
And that's usually at that point you see what's going on, the failure. It's already a nightmare. So it's usually good to check that at least once a year.
Yeah. And then see if there's any decorative elements. If you have, exposed rafter tails, if you have your, what else would be part of the roof? And, any, I can't think of what they're called, lightning rods, anything like that, double check all of that and see if the chimney also has any issues, if it needs mortar added to it, if it's starting to sag, lean, bow, if your chimney cap's in good place, if your mortar is already really bad and you have loose or missing bricks, that would be an issue. And then the next step that we look at is windows and doors. So, are they operating properly? Sometimes sometimes they swell. They swell in the summer and shrink in the winter, which isn't helpful. But they see if they're working the way they're supposed to. If the windows open and close, see if there's any glass. If there's broken glass, loose glazing. Loose glazing is a big issue for energy efficiency. Because if you make sure your whole system is tight, then your windows will be more energy efficient. Let's see. And then your stops, everything, make sure your windows are all tight. Then look for signs of rot. Look for if the joints are starting to separate at the corner. So if it's a mortise and tenon and it fits in together, you want to make sure that those joints are tight together. See if there's any water infiltration, if any settling, if there's paint loss, because that could just be paint wearing away from sun or water, but it could also be a sign of water getting into the actual door. See if the hardware is working the way it's supposed to. If the sash cords or chains are there, usually the chains last. It's the cords that break. And that's not a huge fix, but it's something that makes your windows work better. Check and see how your weather stripping is. If there's storm windows, if they're damaged or missing, if they're fitting tight, if there's missing or damaged screens, just anything that would need to be repaired or needs some attention. And then usually we then working from top to bottom, we go to the foundation. And most older buildings have masonry foundations. But that would be, always make sure the water is going away from the building. So make sure your water is draining away from the foundation. So you want to have your soil at the highest, like your highest point needs to be at the building, and then you want it to swoop away. If your masonry is, though, if it's flaking, crumbling, spalting, which is when the face of the brick pops off, or cracking, that's usually, there's water getting in and in the freeze-dry cycle. If you have spalting, that's usually a sign that you used mortar that was too hard for the brick, and you've damaged the brick now permanently.
And Portland cement is what's being used in that, and it's not good for old brick at all.
Right. You want to look for loose or damaged masonry, and if you're having some of the crumbling or cracking, that could be water getting in and then freezing behind. Loose mortar, water infiltration. And then the structure, is it bulging? Is it bowing? Has it moved? Settling is okay as long as it's not continuing to move. Because if it's continuing to move, that means something is happening that's causing that. It's not just settling. There's something structurally happening.
Yeah, it could be anything like water, even a small bit of water getting in a corner of your foundation can cause it to settle even more. And that's a big issue because, a 150-year-old house shouldn't be doing that at that point.
Right.
So there's definitely, if it's moving now after that long, there's something going on that needs to be looked at.
Look for any vegetation growth, and that would be also on the roof, especially if you're in a really moist and wet area. Algae, moss, vines. Vines are really bad on masonry. If you get that vision of an English manor house with vines growing on the outside. The vines, the way they creep up and grow on the wall, actually pull the mortar out. So it's really bad for your building to have them on.
And yes, even though some people like the little tree in their gutter, it's totally bad for the house.
Right.
I've seen trees growing in gutters and
I've seen it out of
masonry walls.
Yeah.
We've seen it trees growing out of everywhere in a building, and it's not good because the roots and everything will push it apart.
Yeah, and then also the same as, make sure that your water is draining away from the foundation. Make sure your water control is, your stormwater management, that you have all of your spouting and everything moving away from the building. If you're having water infiltration issues, putting a French drain, putting perimeter drains in really can do a lot to save the integrity of the building. So then if you're looking at the exterior wall, depending on what it's made out of really determines what you're looking at. So if it's masonry, you want to see, same as the foundation, you want to see if anything's damaged or deteriorating, the same as stucco. If it's wood, siding, you want to see if it's cracked, if it's loose, if it's rotting, if it's splitting. Typically, for wood, we see rotting like at a downspout, especially if the downspout's leaking. And I was thinking, you see that water on masonry, too. Like if the downspout is leaking out of the downspout, then you will you'll have water issues on the wall that you'll see, and usually you'll see like some algae at the top or running down the wall where the water's coming through. And then let me see, if it's a log, it's pretty much the same as siding, except you want to look for like the voids to see if the voids are getting larger.
Yep. Because if water gets in there, and the thing is, most people think because there's big cracks and things in a log building that it needs to be filled and everything. That's not the case. I mean,
it can be, and
it can be, and it kind of helps it. But as long as the wood is able to dry out, there's no problem with log woods.
Right. Yeah. And and then you want to some of the things that I talked about, like the staining on the walls, the algae, the paint loss if you have water painting or peeling, and anything like that shows you that the moisture is getting in. You want to make sure that that's not there. The structural, if you see any walls leaning, bowing, bulging, and there are some buildings, like I say that and I think, oh, there's no buildings that I can think of several in our immediate area that I'm not sure why nobody has intervened. Like there's one that there's probably at least a 6-inch bulge in the house in Marietta that they just put siding over.
Yep. Yeah. Cover it up, make it go away.
Yeah. So if there's cracks, because that shows you that it's moving, especially if they're new cracks. And then if the door and window openings aren't square, that's pretty typical in an older house. But if you have new issues is the biggest problem with that. Your porch floors, if there's missing boards, loose boards, if it's rotting, paint would also be another indication there. And then if there's any decorative elements such as the cornice or anything like that, then you can look at the entire outside and make sure that would maintain your entire exterior of the house, and then everything inside, unless there's structural work to be done, would be cosmetic or utilities.
Mm-hmm.
So our Facebook question, or not our Facebook question, our emailed in question was regarding paint. We had 2 people ask about painting, and someone asked about refinishing and painting old repurposed wood that was 50 to 100 years old, removal of the old paint, stabilizing the existing paint, sealing the joints, edge priming, and top coating. So there's a couple different things with paint that we can talk about. Prepping is the key to a good paint job, no matter if it's a in a historic building or a new building.
And that cannot be expressed enough. 98% of painting is prep. If the prep is not done properly, it shows completely through.
You want to make sure it's clean. You want to make sure it's dry. So after you clean it, you want to make sure it's dried out. You don't want to paint wet wood. You want to make sure it's sound. So you want to make sure you're getting down to a solid surface. So if your paint's peeling, and it depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to remove the lead-based paint, remove it down to bare wood
safely.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that. But if your goal is to just encapsulate the lead paint, which is very fine under the guidelines, you can just get down to paint that is still adhering to the wood. And once you're down to that, then you have a sound surface. Mm-hmm. And then you want to make sure it's dull. So in between coats, you want to sand with really fine sandpaper so that the paint has something to adhere to. So Jonathan can talk a little bit about the lead paint rules. It's the RRP guideline for the EPA. And anybody that works on an older building built before 1978 needs to be RRP certified.
And it's really, once you know some of this, it's just simple things, how to take care of the lead paint. If you don't know, you got to consider it's lead. And first and foremost, people always underestimate lead paint when they have kids. Something as simple as carrying an old sash around day after day that has lead paint on it can actually cause problems in young kids.
Well, and we just had it was in the paper last weekend. There was an Amish family who were repurposing old sash for crafts, and the entire family was lead poisoned because they weren't using proper lead techniques. They weren't cleaning their hands, changing their clothes, showering. They weren't doing. And we've had other cases like that. There was at Trinity Lutheran in Lancaster, maybe 10 years ago, there was a worker that was working on the steeple that went home, and his toddler had lead poisoning because he didn't clean his work clothes when he came home, and then coming home and then sitting on the sofa gets that lead paint all over, or the lead dust all over your sofa.
It's all over the sofa. Yeah. And literally, by walking in, even if like having a tiny paint chip this big laying on the floor, you step on it, and next thing you know, that whole thing could be spread through the house in just a matter of hours.
Yeah. So you have to be very careful.
Basically, what you need to do is just safely remove it. Wear respirators, gloves. If you're going to be sanding it, stripping it, whatever, make sure that you're doing it in a safe way, that it's sealed off. And whatever clothes you wear, take them off and wash them. I mean, this day and age, you got plenty of clothes that you can just wash and change them. Yeah. Till the next day if you have to.
And the other thing that we've done before when we've had a lot of lead to paint or to remove in the shop, we've gotten like the coveralls, the coveralls that our employees weren't taking that home with them.
And if you're going to do it that way, throw them out each day.
Yeah, you have to throw them out.
You can't. Once you take it, you're taking it on and off. You're already contaminating other parts.
Yeah. And the other thing too is, and I've watched this happen, you have to be really mindful of, if you're smoking, if you're eating, if you're drinking, you have to wash your hands and your face before if you're stripping paint or working with lead paint. So there's the paint, it is hard, selecting what type of paint to use. Typically we use an oil-based primer, a really good oil-based primer, because that you can still buy oil-based primer in America because of the EPA rules on the VOCs. Probably it's over 10 years ago now. It's probably closer to 15. You can't buy oil-based paint that's manufactured in America. So we use a good oil-based primer and then 2 coats of latex, a good quality latex. There's wide-ranging paints and paint options. I wouldn't choose rubberized paint because that'll just trap water. If you're going with a modern solution, there are traditional choices also that you can order and use. The other thing that we sometimes do, especially if it's going to for sealing, well, for sealing we use the oil-based primer, and we'll paint all sides as we install, even your cut edges. Yep. So that helps to seal it. If you're not going to paint it, we have used UV Plus. That has a little bit of a tint in it, and we've also used what's that Wood Life Classic. Mm-hmm. And some people do use that as like their prep for before they paint, mm-hmm. as on their seal. So that's another option. The other thing, if you want to prep before you paint for antifungal, insecticide, would be to use Boracare. You have to let that sit, or you have to let the boards that you've treated sit for 48 hours before you primer them. But then that does provide you with a seal, not a
it
seal.
Helps with them with mold
a protection,
like termites and stuff like that.
Yeah,
it wants to eat into the wood.
The only insect it doesn't stop from eating is carpenter bees, and it does have it does have a where's my brain going? It does protect. It's salt based, so it's fairly safe, and it doesn't hurt like animals or plants. If you're applying
it will hurt plants.
Oh, it does. Yeah,
kill plants quick.
Yeah, because of the salt. Yeah. So but it's a fairly natural solution to so that's one other thing that you can do to prep. So then if you're painting masonry, the typical preservation rule of thumb is if masonry's been painted, you can paint it. If it wasn't, don't paint it. And you want to make sure you get something breathable. The mineral silicate paints or the lime washes are made for masonry, and they're very traditional. And you see a lot of the Mediterranean buildings have the lime washes, and then you get the bright colors, and then within like 20 years they fade. They're still pretty, they're still adhering, but you can just reapply them. You can use milk paint. We use it a lot for like decorative painting, but you can use it on your walls. There's an additive that you can use it for the exterior, so that's another natural traditional paint. Fine paints of Europe is expensive. It's probably at least 3 times more expensive than a latex paint.
Well, yeah, and they can get it in latex or oil.
Yeah, you can get it in latex or oil, but if we're going to use that, we'd use the oil. Most people want it because it has a really glossy sheen. That's everybody that we've had use that. That's what they want.
But you can get it in a
satin. Yeah, you can get it in a satin. It's oil based. It's not an equivalent gallon. It's a
Euro gallon.
Yeah, whatever the European gallon would be.
If you get it, read the directions and follow it to a T. So I would say read them directions 20 times, because if you do not follow it to a T, like it says, lightly sand it and clean it down completely in between each coat. If you don't, you will see little specks of dust throughout it. And literally, you have to follow the directions word for word, or it will look awful.
Yeah, and if you
do, it looks tremendous.
Yeah, and you can, their technical support is great. So, if you have questions, if you need anything, just feel free to call them. They do, what was I thinking? Their primer is very thick. Much thick.
Their paint.
But their paint's not as thick as their primer.
No, their primer is really thick.
So, and the other thing is the linseed oil paint. Now, I will tell you about it with a caveat. We haven't used it. I have a couple gallons of it then they still make it in Sweden. I have a couple gallons in the basement for me to use on our porch. The Park Service sometimes recommends it. The Pennsylvania Museum Commission, we had heard a few years ago, used it at one of the sites in Lancaster County, and they were having issues with mildew. Now, when I was researching to answer this question, I did read that now they're recommending for the linseed oil paint to add zinc to it to prevent mildew growth in North America because our climate is so different than Europe. So we're going to try it on our house. We'll add the zinc to it. We'll let you know, but it is an option for another traditional paint. That is everything that I had for today. Unless we have any questions, I think, did you have anything else, Jonathan?
Nope. That'll
Okay.
be tomorrow.
Yeah, so tomorrow we're planning on going live again at 1 p.m. Eastern time, and we will be covering repair, when to replace, how to choose those materials, and how to choose a contractor. And then we have one question, and our question tomorrow is about wood repair and preservation, which goes really nicely with the topic. So thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of your Saturday.